this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
It's an Olympics you'll never forget. Prime time in Milan. The moments.
Chloe Kim with the gold medal flex.
The stars.
Ilya Malinin.
Out of this world.
The spectacle from beautiful northern Italy with very special guests every night of the Olympics. Experience the world's biggest show. Prime time in Milan, tonight 8/7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
The big game commercials are basically must-see TV. This year, Elf Cosmetics went all out with an absurdly funny telenovela called Melissa. It stars Melissa McCarthy, Nicholas Gonzalez, Itati Cantoral, and Elf Glow Reviver Lip Oil. The Elf Glow Reviver Lip Oil is an ultra-glossy tinted lip oil that nourishes, hydrates, and enhances your lips' natural color.
Watch the full episode of their new Elf novela on soyunbaño.com.
Ever wonder why so many people regain weight after stopping a GLP-1? Up to 40% of the weight lost can come from lean muscle. This weakens the body, slows metabolism, and makes it easier to put the pounds back on, creating a cycle of dependency. Prolon's 5-day fasting-mimicking diet offers a drug-free way to maintain results and support long-term metabolic health. In just 5 days, it activates fasting pathways to burn fat, protect muscle, and rejuvenate cells, all while letting you enjoy real food. Get 15% off plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe at prolonlife.com/iHeart. That's prolonlife.com/iHeart.
Over the last couple years, didn't we learn that the folding chair was invented by Black people because of what happened in Alabama?
The Montgomery Brawl.
This Black History Month, the podcast Selective Ignorance with Mandy B unpacks Black history and culture with comedy, clarity, and conversations that shake the status quo. The Crown Act in New York was signed in July of 2019, and that is a bill that was passed to prohibit discrimination based on hairstyles associated with race. To hear this and more, listen to Selective Ignorance with Mandy B from the Black Effect Podcast Network on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to One Thing Trump Did. It's available exclusively on the Middle podcast feed. I'm Jeremy Hobson. Each week on this podcast, we are looking at one thing President Trump did since there is so much happening, and we're going to try and break things down in the same rational, nonpartisan, factual way we do on the Middle. And before we get started, a reminder that if you like this podcast, please rate it highly and share it with your friends. That's how we grow this thing. So in this episode, our one thing is what's happening with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the cuts from the Department of Government Efficiency. NOAA is in charge of the National Weather Service, which collects data used by meteorologists all over the country to make forecasts and warn you when natural disasters might strike. The entire budget of NOAA is about $6.6 billion. That's out of more than $6 trillion that the government spent last year. Hundreds of workers at NOAA, though, have lost their jobs. In February, hundreds of workers did, and a new round of layoffs could mean 20% of the agency's staff would be cut. A lot of people are angry about that, including Massachusetts Democratic Senator Ed Markey.
Would you rather use a magic 8-ball to know when to evacuate for a hurricane or wildfire, or when to shelter for a tornado? Would you rather your daily weather be yet another subscription service draining your bank account? Or worse yet, have life-saving weather predictions? Use surge pricing like Uber, because that is the Project 2025 plan, which Elon Musk and his DOGE minions have been following line by line to privatize your National Weather Service.
Well, joining me now is meteorologist Jeff Huffman, a weather communication specialist for Barron Weather. He's in Huntsville, Alabama. Jeff, great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Jeremy. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you. And, you know, we know each other because I used to talk to you all the time. Every time there was a big natural disaster happening, you were running the emergency management communication system in Florida to keep people up to date on hurricanes and things like that. So let's start there with your time as a meteorologist. How much do meteorologists like you rely on the work of the National Weather Service?
Well, Jeremy, it's critical. And I would like to briefly kind of explain my path to getting here because I feel like some of these steps along my career have kind of positioned me in a unique situation to kind of understand the middle ground. I think the middle ground on this issue is very tiny, very, very narrow. I started as a commercial broadcaster in Missouri for the first 8 years of my career. And then the job you referenced is my job at the University of Florida for the Florida Public Radio Emergency Network. That was in the public sector, helping NPR stations, such as the one that you spent many, many years with, prepare for extreme weather events. We actually served all stations in the state of Florida and in South Carolina. Similarly to what you mentioned from a budget standpoint, with less than a $200,000 a year budget, we were able to provide that service to all those stations. And then more recently, I moved into the private sector for the company I work with now. So I've kind of, I think I understand this issue in terms of like, obviously there's a lot of heartache and a lot of concern for what is potentially happening to one of the most critical agencies in our country. But on the other side, I can also understand, what is happening from the top down in terms of the cuts.
Well, so explain, how much do meteorologists rely on the National Weather Service?
Well, the Weather Service and all the different agencies of NOAA are super critical. I mean, many of your listeners may not realize that even some of the everyday weather apps they use or the data that they see on television or hear on the radio that is, appears to be a private forecast, a lot of that data comes from NOAA. And if it's cut off, we're looking at potential impact to human life and property. So even the basic data such as a radar image, most of that comes from NOAA-funded radars throughout the country. So any type of cut to this organization or this agency and all the subsidiaries is extremely important to obviously make sure that it's not mission critical. Now, what is mission critical is obviously very subjective, but when it comes to the critical mission of NOAA, which is protecting life and property and supporting all the decision support that goes along with that, and of course the Homeland Security response, all of those services that come from NOAA and the National Weather Service that are about life and property and preparing for the extreme weather in the day and age of our changing climate, that is all, in my opinion, stuff that should be hands off.
Are there any private forecasters doing the level of work that the National Weather Service does, like something like an AccuWeather?
There are many private forecasters or companies that are starting to do much more work that emulates or resembles what NOAA does. And in some cases, I would have to admit that some of the private enterprise does things a little leaner and maybe a little more efficient for their specific audiences. But we have to remember that NOAA and the National Weather Service, they serve not only consumers, but businesses, and they also serve national security interests for our country. So it's really not apples to apples to compare private enterprise to government weather agency work, just because obviously NOAA has to serve many audiences.
Well, and the National Weather Service is also going to care about a storm that might hit in the middle of what we would consider to be nowhere, but in fact people live there, and a private company is probably not going to have the incentive to go in and care that much about a place like that, but NOAA does, or the National Weather Service does.
Yeah, in the digital age, though, that difficulty is made a little easier with some of the derived products and a lot of AI, but you're correct. NOAA still, or National Weather Service still puts humans in the chairs at each office. We call them, local forecast offices, and those experts are still making life-saving decisions for residents in their area that are sometimes are underserved by either a local TV station or maybe underserved by those private enterprises.
So what do we know about the cuts so far?
Well, this is where I kind of have to just kind of monitor. I've definitely am in contact with some close friends at NOAA and in some cases at pretty high levels of different agencies such as the National Hurricane Center. Just like you, I monitor the feeds and the social media, and what I'm deducting from this is that there has been a recognition, at least recently, that maybe DOGE or the administration needs to be a little more careful about what they're doing. I certainly saw some posts from individuals who were victims of that probationary period where they just received a promotion, maybe 20, 30 years of noble service, really good at what they do. And of course, they got the notice that to retire or to resign. That is obviously very disappointing. Hopefully, that is being resolved. 10%, 20%, I think that number's too high for an agency that I already know to be quite lean in terms of what they provide to the general public.
Well, and we know also that some weather balloons have been cut back because of staff shortages. What kind of a difference does that make?
Well, detection, real-time detection, sometimes it's via remote sensing, such as radar data or satellite from space, but in many cases, we still rely on ground truth. And I use ground truth loosely because, believe it or not, airplanes moving through the sky are often sending data back to NOAA and taking observations. That kind of information is critical to the verifying the forecast data. It's critical to going into like a forecast model. And it's just real important from the ground up. So that is obviously disappointing to hear. Thankfully, I've not heard that has been a widespread issue. But when it comes to cutting staff, I understand what's going on at the local level. These local offices, the offices that send up those weather balloons, they've got to make very difficult decisions right now. What makes the cut inside their own operation?
There was severe weather that swept across a lot of the Midwest and the South in the last many days, and we're headed obviously into tornado season coming up here in the next few months. How could these cuts impact the accuracy of meteorologist forecasts, especially ahead of a natural disaster?
Well, I've not met one person from the National Weather Service that is not extremely capable at what they do and an expert at what they do and very dedicated. So I rely on my interactions with them and knowing who they are as a general persona that works there, that they're going to do what's right and do what's most important. So yes, you could make a indirect claim that lives could be at stake. I understand that totally. But I know the people really well that work at these agencies, and they're going to get the job done, even with the cuts, even with the reduced staff. They're going to do their very best day in and day out. So it may be kind of difficult to quantify how these cuts will affect the results of some type of catastrophic event, but certainly we don't like to see it, that's for sure. But I can tell you right now, I know the people that work at these offices, and they're very dedicated, and they will do what they need to do to keep people safe.
But do you think that Americans listening to this right now should feel like they are not going to be as safe because of these cuts?
That's a great question. And, I want to take a step back just personally. I thought of this analogy, if you don't mind me sharing. We all remember when we were young and trying to manage our first bank account. I myself can attest to maybe being a little too careless or carefree with my spending on a weekend. And we may be going to the grocery store on a Monday morning and realizing that, we've overdrawn and our debit card gets declined. Mm-hmm. I know that's a very simple analogy, but I feel like that's kind of what's going on right now is, some of our most critical services are in jeopardy of being cut or not being funded because of maybe some careless spending in other agencies. So that's the really difficult situation we're all in. I definitely think the concern of the cuts affecting the performance and the reliability of NOAA are certainly valid. I must attest, Jeremy, that even now in the private enterprise space, you would maybe be shocked to know that sometimes at the most critical moments, well before this administration took office for the second term, sometimes NOAA data goes down. Sometimes the Weather Service data goes down. Those things have happened. There's been several reports of, the infrastructure with NOAA and the National Weather Service not being kept up to date with the latest technology and with the latest improvements for serving, the entire country at some of the most critical moments. So I guess, even before this administration, even before DOGE, there were certainly some things that probably deserve to be looked at with NOAA. Let's remember that as well from the other side of this perspective. But no doubt, I think the concern that the cuts are going to potentially, cause some degradation in the services, that's very valid. So it's my personal hope that a lot of that gets cleared up, that this gets resolved quickly in the public space.
But so far, it sounds like what you're saying is that the cuts that are happening don't look that strategic or pinpointed to you, more like broad-based cuts without a real plan about who's in and who's out.
Yeah, that's the one criticism I would certainly have. Probably the strongest criticism is it does appear that way, and we've seen that in other government agencies or government organizations. So that has been the methodology or the approach that it's been taken, and certainly that is probably creates more anxiety or concern with that in mind.
We'll stand by for a moment. We're going to take a quick break. I'm speaking with meteorologist Jeff Huffman, who's a weather communications specialist for Barron Weather in Huntsville, Alabama. One Thing Trump Did. We'll be right back in a moment.
It's an Olympics you'll never forget. Prime time in Milan. The moments.
Chloe Kidd with the gold medal flex.
The stars.
Ilya Malinin.
Out of this world.
The spectacle from beautiful northern Italy with very special guests every night of the Olympics. Experience the world's biggest show. Prime time in Milan, tonight 8/7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
Welcome to the A Building. I'm Hans Charles.
I'm Menelik Lumumba. It's 1969. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. had both been assassinated, and Black America was at a breaking point. Rioting and protests broke out on an unprecedented scale.
In Atlanta, Georgia, at Martin's alma mater, Morehouse College, the students had their own protest. It featured two prominent figures in Black history, Martin Luther King Sr. and a young student, Samuel L. Jackson.
To be in what we really thought was a revolution. I mean, people were dying.
1968, the murder of Dr. King, which traumatized everyone.
The FBI had a role in the murder of a Black Panther leader in Chicago.
This story is about protest. It echoes in today's world far more than it should, and it will blow your mind.
Listen to the A Building on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Ryder Strong, and I have a new podcast called The Red Weather.
It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea.
In 1995, my neighbor, Anna Trainer, disappeared from a commune.
It was hard to wrap your head around. It was nature and trees and praying and drugs.
So no, I am not your guru.
And back then, I lied to my parents, I lied to police, I lied to everybody.
There were years, Ryder, where I could not say your name.
I've decided to go back to my hometown in Northern California, interview my friends, family, talk to police, journalists, whomever I can, to try to find out what actually happened.
Isn't it a little bit weird that they obsess over hippies in the woods and not the obvious boyfriend?
They have had this case for 30 years.
I'll teach you sons of to come around here and my wife. Boom, boom.
This is The Red Weather. Listen to The Red Weather on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
14 years in prison for killing a young woman. A 15-year sentence for a crash that caused 3 deaths. 12 and a half years for killing a child and critically injuring her mother. All true stories, all caused by marijuana-impaired drivers. No matter what you tell yourself, if you feel different, you drive different. So, if you're high, just don't drive. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to One Thing Trump Did, exclusively on the Middle podcast feed. I'm Jeremy Hobson. In this episode, we're talking about Trump's cuts to NOAA and the impacts on weather forecasting across the country. I'm joined by meteorologist Jeff Huffman of Barron Weather. Jeff, it seems at the core of Trump's dislike of NOAA specifically, and Project 2025's dislike of NOAA, is climate change. They either don't believe in it or they don't want the U.S. to do anything about it, and therefore understanding what's actually going on from satellite imagery and all the data that NOAA collects may stand in the way. Is that your sense?
I definitely understand that that concern. That is for sure, because obviously we know that our climate is changing and extreme events are becoming more frequent. And in some cases, especially with rainfall and flooding events around the world. And my current job, we're monitoring that all over the globe. So we have to remember that with climate change and with the extreme events, at least this is my personal kind of motive, preparing for the actual event itself, in my opinion, is more important than actually preparing for the holistic climate change as a whole, because the individual events themselves can more directly affect you and your business and your family. And that is something that, I understand that the cuts might impact, and I understand how partisan it can be, this climate change issue. But I firmly believe that whatever we can do and whatever NOAA can do in the Weather Service, and don't forget about Homeland Security and FEMA, whatever they can do to continue to help us as a society prepare for the extreme events, that is by far the priority when it comes to climate change.
Well, how might scaling back NOAA research on climate change make it harder to combat the impacts of climate change?
So That's kind of difficult to answer because I believe that the research on climate change and the response to climate change should be two totally different efforts. I don't have insight exactly as how climate change research is funded and which agency is doing it. I do know that grants and money for risk mitigation can be used for climate research. And that's very important. What I mean by that is when you have a major event, I remember this from working in Florida, you have a few years, like I think 2004, 2005, with many hurricanes hitting the state. And we've had a rash of hurricanes recently. Usually there's money that's granted by the government in terms of mitigating this risk for future occurrences. Mm-hmm. So if you pair the research on climate change to the money that comes in for mitigating that risk, I think that really targets the right areas in terms of this preparedness arena. So I do personally believe that NOAA should possibly be not solely funded by the Department of Commerce. I think there should be something, this is a little bit outside of my purview. I want to make the case again that I think climate change research and response to actually extreme events made worse by climate change should be two completely separate efforts.
Interesting. But at the same time, you want to have the big picture, because if you know that the climate is changing and it's going to cause more extreme weather events, you're better off probably than if you don't know what's going on with the climate. You don't know what's going on with sea level rise. You don't know what's going on with the ocean currents and all kinds of different things that are going to impact what happens.
I could not agree with you more. The antithetical, I guess, to that is, if money has to be spent for preparing for something that might happen 50 years from now due to climate change versus being spent on most critical, life-saving, in-the-moment response or preparedness for a catastrophe that's about to happen, I certainly would argue if you have to make that horrible decision, I would argue it needs to be made in the near term, preparing for an extreme event.
We're talking about this mostly as it relates to ordinary people staying safe from disasters, et cetera. But as you've said, you work with businesses these days. What kind of economic impact do you think that these cuts to NOAA and the National Weather Service will have for businesses that are trying to measure their own risk?
It's a great question. It kind of lines up with who I work for in terms of, the company I work for helps businesses prepare for extreme weather events. So there are many private enterprise companies out there that can kind of fill that gap. But let's not forget, a lot of those private companies receive the data feeds from NOAA and the National Weather Service. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here. You can't, I guess, in simply stated, you can't bite off the hand that feeds you, right? So we are certainly, as a private company and as me personally, I'm certainly hoping for the very best through this very turbulent times at NOAA, because we certainly need those life-saving, critical public safety services from all the agencies of NOAA. But if businesses are concerned, don't forget there is private enterprise that can help them as well. And let's be real. When you're a private business and you are responsible for hundreds of other people that work for your company, or maybe you're responsible for the bottom line of your business, we often hear that businesses don't want to be in the same line that the public is in terms of getting their data from NOAA. So private enterprise certainly provides more reliable data, more beefed up data to help businesses in those situations.
Well, give me an example. You don't have to name names, but tell me how you would prepare a business. What business would be interested in how a natural disaster might affect them, and how do they plan for that as they look ahead?
Sure thing. I think utility companies, telecom companies, those are some very large operations that rely heavily on very accurate, up to the minute, up to the second even, weather data. So like a utility company preparing for a major outage, telecom as well, think about how much money it would cost an airline if they make a mistake, even just staying on the tarmac an extra 30 minutes that they didn't expect. Like, at all the fuel they're spending. So it's more about, obviously, it's a dual full mission. It's about obviously protecting lives, and not only the lives of those businesses as customers, but the business employees as well. But also equally important is their bottom line and making sure they're staying very efficient in what they do and avoiding weather disasters.
So, Jeff, we've been talking about all the things that people might miss if there are cuts. Are there, in the course of your career, are there grievances that people have about NOAA and the National Weather Service?
Well, yeah, as I alluded to with my journey in my career, from commercial broadcast to then public broadcast, which when I was in the public space, I worked hand in hand with weather service personnel, emergency management personnel. because I wasn't often as viewed as media. I was more viewed as a partner. And now I work in private enterprise. So I like I said earlier, I understand that I know the people that are in those chairs making those really tough decisions. They're very dedicated. I certainly am very supportive of everything they do with their job day in and day out. But in the private enterprise space, I've been made aware, and it's been very obvious that there seems to be some deficiencies at times with data feeds, reliability of data. I would say that has gotten better in recent years, but there's no doubt, and I think it's been well documented. There was even some congressional investigation a few years ago into the infrastructure behind NOAA and how to improve the infrastructure, how to make sure that data is reliable, redundant. And so I think that's something that if there is something positive that could come out of these cuts is maybe in looking into that and figuring out maybe the allocation of resources to improve the reliability of their data. And one more thing, there's been a lot, we talked about funding research and projects. That's another thing that just I scratch my head a lot. Now I'm not on, I don't want to say that I'm there understanding every single challenge that NOAA and the Weather Service has, but a project such as FACES, which is a program that began in 2015 it stands for Forecasting a Continuum of Environmental Threats. It's a really great product when it gets done. I mean, we're sitting here a decade later and the project is still in development. Stuff like that, I scratch my head about. And despite the negativity of the cuts, I understand. I sure hope that all gets cleared up. I hope that something positive can come from the DOGE efforts in this administration, and that just like several other agencies, there's an identification of maybe what can be leaner, but also what we need to bolster in terms of resources.
So, Jeff, you're joining us from Huntsville, Alabama, in one of the reddest of the red states.
Yes.
I wonder, as you think about this, and like if I were to go to that rally where Edward Markey in Massachusetts was, and everybody pulling their hair out saying, I can't believe that these cuts are happening. This is going to harm us. This is going to hurt us as a country. This is going to hurt the world. How do people feel where you are about this? And your colleagues, are they, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're making cuts to the National Weather Service? Or are they sort of going, well, I wonder what they're cutting. Is this going to be okay in the end? That kind of thing.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I usually say I'm from Huntsville, and I do not mention the Alabama part. Huntsville is a very purple city, and well, at least this area can be. So it's difficult. I've had some very difficult conversations with friends who work at the Weather Service or friends in the broadcast industry. I think at least for me, it's pretty easy to point out the partisanship. I think a lot of the claims that lives are going to be at stake. Some of that stuff is, like I mentioned earlier, not necessarily apples to apples. It's more indirectly it could happen, but it's more of a hypothetical. So I kind of try to filter some of that out, even though I understand that concern, and I understand that any type of reduction in the resources to NOAA and the Weather Service could really compromise critical services. On the other side, I have friends and family who are just cut it all. We don't need the Weather Service, blah, blah, blah. Those are obviously uneducated opinions in terms of where the data comes from. Like I mentioned earlier, nearly every single weather app you open or every single forecast you see on TV, even if it's from a private enterprise, chances are a significant portion of that data comes from NOAA and the Weather Service. And it would not be a good forecast without it.
Jeff, I grew up in Tornado Alley in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. I lived in New York City during Hurricane Sandy. That was pretty incredible to live through. But I just was in Los Angeles for the wildfires, and that was by far the scariest natural disaster that I've ever lived through, because it's so immediate. It's like, oh, the fire started, right around the corner from you, and it's going to, grow exponentially in just a matter of minutes, and you don't even know what's going on by the time you have to get up and leave your house. What about you? What's the most intense weather event that you've ever lived through?
Well, ironically, that's where I got my passion for meteorology and more importantly for the broadcast side, is I lived through a couple of very close calls with tornadoes at a young age in southern Missouri. And I've also been a lightning strike victim. You may have not known that about me.
I didn't know that.
In a car, though, I was saved from the grounding of the car. That was obviously eye-opening, and I've also seen firsthand how flash flooding can move your car off the road. So just like you, I mean, this weather affects us all, and we all have to kind of weather it together. And in these situations, I understand the passion because of those who have been affected by extreme weather events. Obviously, when you see that NOAA is going to be cut, it probably leads to some type of very extreme reaction and very big concern. I understand that totally. Like I said earlier, with that context and understanding that weather does affect us all, I sure hope that the administration and those at DOGE have recognized that this is maybe an agency that if you did need to cut it, you needed to go in with a little bit more with a fine-tooth comb or a little more surgical in the cuts. Maybe call me an optimist. Hopefully that will be recognized real soon in future updates on this issue.
That is Jeff Huffman, who's a weather communication specialist for Barron Weather. He's a meteorologist joining us from Huntsville, Alabama. Jeff, great to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening to One Thing Trump Did. It was produced by Brandon Condritz and Harrison Patino. Our next middle episode will be in your podcast feed later this week. We'll be live from Colorado Public Radio to talk about the future of American energy. And if you like this podcast, you can rate it wherever you get your podcast. Tell your friends and make sure you sign up for automatic downloads. Our theme music was composed by NOAA Haidu. I'm Jeremy Hobson. Talk to you next time.
Over the last couple years, didn't we learn that the folding chair was invented by Black people because of what happened in Alabama?
The Montgomery Brawl.
This Black History Month, the podcast Selective Ignorance with Mandy B unpacks Black history and culture with comedy, clarity, and conversations that shake the status quo. The Crown Act in New York was signed in July of 2019, and that is a bill that was passed to prohibit discrimination based on hairstyles associated with race. To hear this and more, listen to Selective Ignorance with Mandy B from the Black Effect Podcast Network on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
1969, Malcolm and Martin are gone. America is in crisis. And at Morehouse College, the students make their move.
These students, including a young Samuel L. Jackson, locked up the members of the Board of Trustees, including Martin Luther King Sr. It's the true story of protest and rebellion in Black American history that you'll never forget. I'm Hans Charles.
I'm Menelik Lumumba.
Listen to The A Building on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
14 years in prison for killing a young woman. A 15-year sentence for a crash that caused 3 deaths. 12 and a half years for killing a child and critically injuring her mother. All true stories. All caused by marijuana-impaired drivers. No matter what you tell yourself, if you feel different, you drive different. So, if you're high, just don't drive. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
When segregation was a law, one mysterious Black club owner, Charlie Fitzgerald, had his own rules.
Segregation in the day, integration at night.
It was like stepping on another world.
Was he a businessman, a criminal, a hero?
Charlie was an example of power. They had to crush him.
Charlie's Place, from Atlas Obscura and Visit Myrtle Beach. Listen to Charlie's Place on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human. Quality proteins aren't just for special occasions. With Omaha Steaks, you get mouth-watering proteins delivered right to your door. Individually packaged and portioned, so a great dinner is just minutes away. From Taco Tuesday to a weekend feast, taste the Omaha Steaks difference. Start getting flavorful proteins delivered today. Visit omahasteaks.com and get $35 off with promo code AUDIO at checkout. That's omahasteaks.com, code AUDIO. Terms apply. See site for details.